Hello and welcome to the Procurement Podcast, brought to you by BizClick and our sponsors for this series, Amazon Business. This is your go-to podcast for all things procurement. If you're ready to move from being a tactical buyer to a strategic leader, you're in the right place. Tune in and together we can build a better bottom line. I'm Aaron McMillan, editor of Procurement Magazine and your host for this podcast series.
Hello and welcome back to the Procurement Magazine podcast. I am your host and senior editor of Procurement Magazine and Supply Chain Digital, Aaron McMillan. This episode comes to you live from our London office here at Waterloo, and I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Terry from Evoke. Hi Ben, how's it going?
Morning, thanks for having me, Aaron.
Our pleasure. Really looking forward to our conversation today. Just before we jump into it, do you mind just kind of introducing yourself and tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I've been working in procurement or thereabouts for almost 20 years now. Had a variety of different roles. My current position is Chief Procurement Officer at Evoke, which is a betting and gaming business in London, which is home to brands such as William Hill, 888 and Mr. Green. Prior to that, I've worked across various different categories and various different businesses, the likes of Entain, the John Lewis Partnership, Sony PlayStation, as I said, across different categories and at various different stages of their life cycle. So fairly diverse path to get here today, let's say.
Yeah, really, really interesting career path, which led you to your role now at Evoke. Before we kind of delve into your movements, how did you kind of get started? What kind of drew you to the industry, working in procurement? Something you always thought about doing or kind of fell into it like a lot of other people say they did?
Yeah, I think very much the latter. My first I guess role post university was actually at a record label in London, working in their technology team, which was in the late 90s and a fairly turbulent time for the music industry, let's say, but fantastic experience. Taught me a lot of resilience and working with a really, really diverse group of people. I think I realised pretty quickly that technology on its own wasn't the pure focus for me. So I ended up, as I think a lot of people do, pivoting more to the sort of commercial supplier, I guess, element of things. And then I went on to do similar roles in that space at PlayStation for a good period of time. Did some work in events. And then ended up at John Lewis, which was a really interesting point in its development, pivoting, I guess, from retail to digital in terms of that omnichannel piece. Learned a lot there, worked with some great people, and then was asked to set up a procurement content function at Entain, which actually my first day at Entain was, I think, the first day of lockdown in 2020. So that was an interesting baptism of fire into a new industry, but really enjoyed it. Was there for a few years and landed at Evoke, leading their procurement journey about 18 months ago.
Really would like to delve in a little bit more about the working in the music industry and that record. So what was kind of like the most important lesson you learned? You said it made you quite resilient. So what would you kind of say was the standout story from that time of your life?
I think, it was an interesting period for the industry, which was going from digital product to is the advent of Napster and so on and so forth. So pretty challenging. I think as a new joiner there, we had about 2 days handover, and then we were pretty much in at the deep end. So I think that a lot of confidence really in terms of it, huge challenge, moving very quickly, completely in at the deep end, over my head effectively, barely dealing with a lot of really big characters, being right at the bottom of the ladder. But I think it, definitely helped me. There's a lot of lessons in there in terms of how you work with people, and how you build confidence and build resilience. That's, I think, served me well for the last 15 years or so.
And what was it like working at PlayStation? Kind of the video game industry has gone from strength to strength every year, and now is just a complete behemoth when it comes to the entertainment industry. You must have seen kind of real kind of growth during your time there. What was it like working there during your years?
Yeah, I think PlayStation's a great company, very much a family feel. I think started in London from a European perspective with an office of like 10 people, and now it's become, from a European perspective, a huge business. Again, significant change in that time, moving from effectively a physical box-based console business to a digital services play. Um, Pivoting really also from a kind of Japanese-led business to a West Coast of America, so very different culturally. And also I was there for a long time. It felt like a series of small jobs though, if you like, because of the console life cycle of iteration. I was there for PS3, PSP, PS4, and left just before PS5. So always new technology. I think the thing that surprised me with the video gaming industry is people's emotional attachment to what is effectively a big corporate brand. Have Sony and Microsoft, if you like, in the console wars, and people very emotive about their platform of choice, if you like, which was kind of new to me when I stepped into that space.
Yeah, I suppose you don't really think about it from an outside, but once you go in, like you said, there is that kind of sheer brand loyalty to, like you said, those major.
It's almost tribal, I think, at times, which is something that's is incredibly powerful hook for those businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. You only have to go scrolling on any social media platform for 5 minutes to find that tribalism. Obviously, very kind of unique career in the essence that you kind of always a changing industry. Have you found throughout your career, obviously through the years, the challenges have changed, but have you found kind of across industries those core ones remain, or they kind of slightly different? Was it kind of a bit of both?
Yeah, I think a bit of both. There's definitely some common themes and threads that persist. I think I've worked in retail and digital, and I think the threads of how you get the best out of those channels, whether they're converging or diverging, I think is a really interesting one, and actually one where procurement's quite well placed to play a role. And I think really just building relationships and building the value proposition that that procurement can bring. I think it's been something that I've focused on throughout my career, really. I think procurement's a lot of things to a lot of people, but I very much see it as a commercial animal, basically. So that's something that I think has been a challenge and a journey, I guess, as we've gone along the way.
And you personally, what has kind of inspired those kind of dramatic career industry shifts when you're kind of changing roles? Is it you come to the end of something, you feel like you've seen everything? Do you want a fresh start? What is it that kind of drives you to, constantly change, where, you could easily stay in the same industry, become an expert, climb up and kind of, become a chief procurement officer and stay there for years?
Sure. I think the diversity of challenge is something that's really, really interesting for me. As you said, some things naturally come to their end. But I think the combination of people, where a business is in its life cycle, and the challenge ahead is something that's really, really interested me. And I do think that kind of breadth of experience and working in areas with different challenges just gives you a more rounded perspective in terms of not just from a professional perspective, from a personal perspective as well. So I think, that being kind of restless and always looking for the next development, whether that's in your current role or in a new industry, is something that's always been interesting to me.
You mentioned kind of wanting to address the challenge ahead. Is there a drive from you to kind of always find that next challenge to solve? Do you find yourself as a bit of you're someone who's driven to find solutions?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And I think also our ability as a, I guess, procurement profession to reshape demand rather than just receive it, I think is really important. And definitely I like being in situations and building teams in areas where we can be commercially creative, add real business value, and potentially stretch the boundaries of what you might traditionally perceive as procurement's remit, if you like.
How do you encourage that creativity within a team? How do you kind of get the team working together to solve problems in a unique way? How do you foster that environment?
I think actually it's quite a big one for me. I think procurement has a really unique perspective. And I think sometimes we underplay that. In terms of at an enterprise level, we have a view across functional areas, P&Ls, brands, geographies, different operational models in a way that not everyone does. So I think that perspective is really important for me and my teams to recognise, in terms of we have a sense of the sum of the parts, and we potentially have the opportunity to see where there's opportunities for value that others may not. So trying not to get, I guess, boxed off or stuck in our lane, I think is something that I really encourage, because ultimately we're here to deliver business value. And if that sits in our traditional footprint, great. But if it sits in a completely different commercial arena, whether that's revenue, M&A, etc., like, my view is we do the best that we can for the business that we're working in, and be curious wherever possible.
This podcast is in partnership with Amazon Business. Amazon Business is your one-stop destination for everything your organisation needs. Think of it as the Amazon you already know and love, but specifically re-engineered for the way you work. Amazon Business gives you access to business-only pricing on millions of items and quantity discounts that scale with your growth. It's about spending less time bogged down in those manual tasks and more time on what really matters. So head over to Amazon Business and make the power of Amazon work for you.
Obviously, you reinforce that really kind of positive effect that procurement can have on a business, but sometimes internally procurement is seen as something else. Bit of red tape, bit of the, people who control the money, people who say no a lot. How do you go about, when you work in a new company, kind of shredding that label?
Yeah, and I think that's a really valid point. I think I would probably use the word chameleon, to be honest, in terms of procurement, because we have to be all things to all people. If I'm talking to my CFO, he has a different agenda to potentially the chief commercial officer or chief legal officer. So I think our ability to flex, whether that's within stakeholders, business life cycles, macroeconomic shocks, all of those things are really, really important in terms of generating credibility. And I think, one size fits all just doesn't work. I think probably the other thing for me is understanding the business, the sector and the industry that you work in, understanding your value chains, understanding your suppliers, and being able to talk to your stakeholders in a language that they understand. I think procurement have got a pretty bad reputation for using terminology that is really important and valuable to them, but doesn't actually mean a lot in the wider business scope. So I think that communicating that is something that's really important as well, and just talking the language that people understand.
I really like that term. Procurement chameleons, kind of adjusting, changing your colours to work in the environment, something that you've obviously done throughout your career. So you're telling someone they need to do that, but perhaps another roadblock people face is that trust, building trust. So how can a team start to build trust? The procurement team build trust with the wider business.
Yeah, and I think it's not really any different to how you build relationships and trust. In the wider context, right? It's doing what you say you were going to do when you said you were going to do it. It's trying to be as transparent as possible. It's trying to listen to people. And understand that you don't have all the answers. There's multiple ways to get to your destination, and just respecting people's opinions, even if they don't agree with your particular perspective. So for me, it's pretty straightforward, really, in terms of how you build trust on a human level. Clearly, from a delivery perspective, the more you can articulate value and bring things to the table and deliver business value, the more trust that you're going to get. But ultimately, that only happens over time.
So we've spoken about becoming chameleon, we've spoken about building trust. Then from that kind of final step, how do you make sure your procurement process isn't the ones holding up a deal when there's great business on the table? How do you ensure that you're seeing things through to the end, completing a deal, but also kind of doing your due diligence, which is so important now with regulations in place? So take us to that kind of final step.
Yeah, and I think balance for me is the key word there, in terms of process, particularly really important to to build trust and credibility in terms of it's something repeatable and it's something people understand. I think simplicity is really overlooked as well. I think we're definitely guilty of overcomplicating things at times. But I think also having process that enables your commercial intent, that doesn't inhibit it. As I said, I'm really focused on commercial value. So having that commercial value diluted by process is almost the worst possible thing for me. I would probably err more on the side of a bit more fluidity that's driving that value, and then embed that process alongside it. And I think with technology and AI, this is becoming easier and easier. But again, it's just about that balance in terms of how we don't go too far, and with the process ultimately is a means to an end, which is commercial value.
You mentioned obviously technology and AI there. A lot of conversations dominate about AI. You can't go a day in this industry without hearing about it. So I was wondering if you could tell me about, where AI is actually proving to be helpful in procurement today for you personally. Where are you finding the value from such a tool?
Sure. So I think, ultimately, AI, really anything that drives customer value is hugely beneficial, and a lot of businesses, I think, are focusing at the the tip of the spear, if you like, in terms of how does it improve their customer experience, drive revenue, improve growth. I think from a procurement perspective, I very much see there is a lot of opportunity there, particularly in terms of the more time-consuming things that we do. I think one of the things that has been an issue for procurement for a long time is we spend more of our time doing non-value add work than potentially we would like. So I do see, whether that's reviewing contracts, whether that's manipulating data, whether that's managing sourcing exercises. Yeah, as I said, all means to an end, but any technology and automation that would help us in that space ultimately allows us to focus our creativity and focus our time on things that unlock more value. So there's a lot of technology, I think, coming through. There's a lot of people trying to get their heads around the best use cases for it, not just in procurement. I think that will continue, and the pace will only increase.
A lot of, maybe when I speak to leaders in this podcast, they find their teams perhaps feel uncertainty or anxiety towards AI. Let's kind of flip on that head. In this kind of era of AI emergence, what's the kind of the human superpower that remains? What's something that AI can never replace?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think for me, you still really want those procurement people who are able to understand value chains, who are able to potentially identify leverage in situations and also build partnerships. And those things really key and things that I really like to see in my teams. And I think we just have to be conscious of the fact that whilst we're using AI, it's hugely beneficial and hugely effective for us. It also changes the way that we look at our talent to some degree, in terms of we are potentially prioritizing systems thinking, data analysis, but we still need those critical commercial creativity capabilities that I talked about.
So we look ahead to the future now. What does the procurement team in the future look like? Are those kind of maybe traditional roles, those entry-level roles, are they starting to die, or are they more starting to kind of change with the introduction of AI?
Yeah, I think it's only time will tell is the sort of fence-sitting answer to that. But I do think the shape's going to change. I think we'll end up with smaller teams potentially, with probably a lot of the middle being automated. And we'll end up with a smaller team of more commercial generalist procurement people who are able to manage those agentic solutions. But I think there is an open question around how does that feed into the talent that's coming into the profession. A lot of us, like myself, of more senior years have gone through the kind of buyer category manager steps, which I think is hugely valuable. So there is a bit of a question for me around how do you make sure you don't lose that real world experience, but potentially allow yourself to accelerate to more strategic and value adding work quicker.
You spoke about building talent, building teams. What's one skill you look for in a new employee that perhaps you wouldn't look kind of 2, 3, 5 years ago?
I think it's actually one that I probably look for my whole career, but maybe in different contexts. But I think it's curiosity. I think I talked before around being able to shape demand and business thinking rather than just being reactive and in receipt of demand. I think is really important. It's becoming more important around AI technology and different emerging trends in the industry. So I think for me, looking for someone who's really curious to challenge the status quo, understand what's going on in the wider world, and finding creative solutions, it's always been important, but it's becoming even more important because of the complexity of the landscape that we operate in.
Driving that curiosity perhaps doesn't come natural to some people. How would you encourage people listening to this who want to be more curious? What kind of steps would you recommend? How can we become more curious?
Yeah, I think it is something. It's a muscle you learn, right? I think it's a skill that you develop as you go through your career. But I think understanding the industry and the business and the products and the customers that you serve is a really good starting point to that. If you don't understand your business model, your competitors, and your value chains, it's really difficult to really get under the skin of where the value is. So I think for me, if you read the trade press, if you talk to your suppliers, you talk to competitors, in the right way, you talk to peers, and really understand the environment that you're operating in at a deep level, it actually helps you in terms of being able to identify and potentially challenge some things that you see and you don't understand why. And I think as long as you do that in a constructive and respectful way, then that's a great bedrock for it.
You've had such an incredible career across so many industries and so many senior roles within them. If you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice for you at the start of your career, what would it be?
That's a big question. I think, again, it's probably hindsight's a beautiful thing, right? But I think just having courage in your convictions in terms of that, if you understand the environment you're in, and if you have a gut feeling, if you like, I think it's one of those things that probably earlier in my career I may have second guessed myself, but actually following through on those thoughts and building business cases and being data driven is, I think it's a really good skill to have. So I think just be confident in your in the things that you think about and have courage of your conviction. Yeah,
it's an important lesson for life, not only just for your career. Is trust your gut. If you're ever feeling towards something, trust that feeling and lean into it. Ben, something we like to do on the podcast is we like to get leaders kind of speaking to one another and asking questions. So I'm going to ask you a question from our last guest on the podcast who said, how does this period of uncertainty become an opportunity or a challenge for your procurement organisation? Does it challenge your organisation? Does it weaken it? So what kind of are the opportunities and the challenges that you're facing kind of in this era of uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a big question as well. Yeah, I think, it kind of goes back to the chameleon point we talked about earlier, because, as much as we all sit here and say, we want to be doing commercial, strategic, very transformational work, that unfortunately isn't always the reality in the world we operate in. So I think there is an opportunity to show that we can wear many hats, right? We can be focused on short-term tactical cash crisis management whilst also looking at value chains and longer term potential commercial value. So I think that ability to be agile and just really, really focusing on the commercial outcomes is a big opportunity, because I think if we get that right, we will end up with hugely more credibility, and just I think the opportunities for curious, talented people in procurement are probably bigger than they've ever been.
To be a chameleon be curious, kind of really good kind of mantras to live by. And Ben, I want to give you the opportunity now to kind of pay that forward and ask a question to our next speaker on the podcast. It could be anything at all.
Yeah, and I think we've touched on it already, but I'd be curious to overuse that word, but to understand in terms of talent and looking for people for your team, what is the single most trait that you value most and you see as most important for the next 2 years?
Perfect. Really interesting question. Looking forward to asking that to our next guest. Well, Ben, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you so much for your time.
Yep.
Before we let you go, we've got time for our finale. So I'm going to ask you 3 quick fire questions. Just answer the first thing that comes to mind with them. So the first one is, what's the most exciting thing about the future of procurement?
For me, it's just the opportunity for people who are talented and curious to really develop themselves, both in procurement and beyond it, based on what we talked about.
What's one thing people still get wrong about procurement?
I'm going to say nothing, actually. I think people say what they see. So ultimately, you reap what you sow on that front.
Very interesting. First one to give me an answer like that's quite interesting, quite reflective for people to kind of look in the way that they're operating. And finally, what piece of technology we rely on now will be obsolete in 5 years?
I think specifically in the procurement space, any technology where we are just hoarding documentation or data without any kind of AI-driven insight or structure is just not going to happen anymore. It's having that metadata so powerful. So any kind of flat processes, SaaS structures, repositories will just get washed away pretty quickly, I think.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your answers today, Ben. And I've really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Likewise, appreciate it.
Perfect. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Procurement Magazine podcast. Be sure to tune in next week for another insightful conversation. We'll see you then.